Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 7th webinar of this year's Equal Justice Talk series, proudly presented by the ARC of New Jersey's Criminal Justice Advocacy Program. Each month, we are committed to providing you with crucial insights into the criminal justice system and its relationship with the disability community. Firstly, just let me introduce myself. For those who don't know me, my name is Robin Holt, and I am the Director of the Criminal Justice Advocacy Program. The ARC stands as a national advocacy and service organization devoted to children and adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as well as their families. In New Jersey, the ARC includes the Criminal Justice Program, as well as several other advocacy initiatives, along with 20 local county chapters that offer direct services to people with IDD across all 21 counties. So for more information into the ARC's mission and our programs, you could find more at www.arcnj.org. This year, our Equal Justice Talks theme is Beyond Boundaries, Innovative Approaches for IDD in the Criminal Justice System. Our goal is to delve into sort of the lesser known and less discussed facets of the field, exploring alternative viewpoints and ideas that significantly impact individuals with IDD. Today's webinar, titled Autism Spectrum Disorders and the Criminal Justice System, Strategies for Prevention and Navigation, will feature Elizabeth Kelley and Nick Dubin. Before I introduce our esteemed guest speakers, let's address some housekeeping matters. Recordings of all of our webinars are accessible on our website, which is www.cjapnj.org, along with other valuable resources. The Equal Justice Talk series is made possible through the support of the New Jersey State Bar Foundation and is a contribution of the ARC of New Jersey's Criminal Justice Advocacy Program. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived. The recording will be available on our website shortly, and you will receive an email notification once that is available to you. If you would like to submit questions for our speakers, you could do so at any time by typing them into the question box, which is located on the right side of your screen within the GoTo webinar control panel. Our speakers will address questions at the end of their presentation. In case we do run short, we'll try to get those questions answered for you. Should you encounter any connectivity issues during the webinar, simply log back in. And for any other issues, you could click on the Help menu at the top of the GoTo webinar control panel. Now, with all of that said, it is my honor and pleasure to present both of our distinguished speakers. Presenter Elizabeth Kelley is a criminal defense lawyer nationwide, focused on representing people with mental disabilities. She is the editor of several books published by the American Bar Association, including Representing People with Autism Spectrum Disorders, Representing People with Dementia, and Representing People with Mental Disabilities. Presenter Nicholas Dubin is an autistic author with professional expertise and personal experiences involving encounters with the criminal justice system. Nick shares his personal history, highlighting some of the challenges experienced by an autistic person growing up in the 1980s and 1990s. He also highlights the efforts, including his own personal experiences, to help others on the spectrum so that they do not have to deal with what he has experienced in his life. So with all of that said, I will turn the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for having us, Robin. It's really a pleasure for Elizabeth and I to be presenting for the ARC of New Jersey. Elizabeth and I have presented many times together and have worked together professionally, so it's great to be here. And this is a very important topic, and I really hope that the things that we have to say today you'll take back to your communities and try to move forward and make a difference on these issues because they're very important. I'm going to be talking about the prevention aspect of trying to keep people on the autism spectrum from falling into the criminal legal system. And Elizabeth is going to be talking about the navigational aspects because she's helped countless clients on her end once they have fallen into the criminal legal system. So that's how we decided to navigate this presentation. So I want to talk about how autistic people sometimes end up in the criminal justice system. And I want to start out by first saying that autistic people are usually the victims of crime more often than they are the perpetrators. A lot of what we're going to be talking about today is once an autistic person becomes involved in the criminal justice system, but I always like to start out with the caveat that autistic people are usually the victims. And I think there could be a whole presentation given on that as far as mate crime issues, where a person is in a relationship and the other person takes advantage of a person on the spectrum. We just don't have time to go into all of that, unfortunately, but that is another huge topic that could probably be a webinar in and of itself. So where do we see typical encounters? And when I say situational, I mean something that could just be a happenstance encounter where somebody happens to fall afoul of the criminal justice system. This can be when they're pulled over, and once they're pulled over, an autistic person such as myself may engage in what I put in quotes as unusual behaviors, and I'm going to get into that in a moment, what that means. It can also happen if there's a wellness check, and instead of trained social workers coming out to the residents, you have police who are coming out, and they come out in a kind of an aggressive frame of mind, not knowing or not willing to understand that the person is in a mental health crisis and doesn't need to be dealt with force. So that can be an issue. Eloping, particularly for younger autistic people and people with higher support needs as we get older. Eloping is a big trigger when you think of the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. That can kick in, and a person on the spectrum can go missing. And as a result of that, the police get involved, and there's a lot of things that can be done. You know, as far as there's some controversial issues like having the person like wear a GPS wristwatch, but that gets into certain civil liberties. It has been known to work though. And we have to be cognizant that minorities on the spectrum, just by being out in public, just by acting a little differently, they have what is, you know, basically a double issue that they have to deal with. Just by being black and brown, even if they were neurotypical, would put them at risk. But then when you add being on the spectrum and the different behaviors that can be factored in, it can call attention to that person. I remember the case of Nellie Lotson a few years ago, who was outside his public library, and he was stimming and making physical movements to keep himself regulated, and the police came, thought he looked suspicious, took him down, and you know, he ended up in jail in solitary confinement. And then fortunately he was pardoned by the governor, but that's not something that we want to see happen to people. That's something you can Google if you want to look that up. So as we're talking about what can go wrong, I already mentioned autistic people can be misinterpreted. A lot of police who have not been trained properly view autistic people as possibly being intoxicated or under the influence. We talked about a person being pulled over. This can happen when they are forced to perform a field sobriety test. Now, I don't know about you, but my motor skills are really not that good. So my heel to toe performance in doing a field sobriety test might, you know, even if I was perfectly sober, I might not be able to do it. And my nervousness, my stimming, all those things could easily be mistaken as being intoxicated or under the influence of drugs. And so that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to talk about some solutions as to how to maybe negate that. We see all the time in the news, if I get Google alerts every day, so I'm aware of these stories, and they come into my mailbox every day, where police are using escalation through unnecessary force when the person on the spectrum is not they're not necessarily being cooperative, but they're not being uncooperative. They just are overstimulated. They just need somebody to slow down, walk them through the process, not put so many demands in their face, particularly if they have a PDA profile. And PDA stands for, I don't like the term, but it's called pathological demand avoidance. Other people describe it as a persistent drive for autonomy. But if you have that profile and somebody is in your face and yelling at you and barking at you, do this, don't do this, and they even start swearing at you, you're going to have a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response that can cause the person to be arrested and taken to jail, and oftentimes that happens. It can also end up in, injury for the autistic person, or very tragically, sometimes the person can be killed. So we really have to be mindful of these things, and I think that calls for a rethinking of how we do our trainings. And I've been somebody who's advocated for autistic people themselves to be part of the trainings. I've wanted police to be going through simulations so they can understand, what it's like to be in the shoes of an autistic person, maybe wearing goggles and hearing all the sensory stimulations that for a neurotypical person may not put them into that fight or flight, but for an autistic person would definitely do that. So I'm a big believer in carrying an autism identification card. I know there are some states where you can voluntarily give your information to the police and they can be kept in a database. I'm not a real big fan of that because I just don't always know what could be done with that information, how it could be used in a discriminatory capacity. Some people are comfortable with it, and if they are, then that's their right, because if they're pulled over, then maybe the officer would know that, hey, this person is on the spectrum. I personally would always carry an autism identification card, though. That's not an infringement on civil liberties. That's your right to do. And let that officer know, assuming they have a bare minimum of training, that, I'm somebody that processes information differently. I know you care about your safety. I'm not here to infringe upon it. So that's what I'll say about that. As far as confrontations with police officers, now I'm going to talk about what happens once the arrest stage happens. And so really, there are two things that I think people get confused. One is when an officer asks for your name and your license, that is something that you're required to do. Elizabeth, you can correct me if I'm wrong about this. You do have to give them identification, but beyond that, you don't have to say anything. So there is a differentiation I want to make between compliance, which is simply, name, ID, registration, et cetera. If you're out, you do have to give them your driver's license. They need to know who you are. But beyond that, you do have the right to remain silent. And I think it's very important to teach this to autistic children and even adolescents and adults. It's counterintuitive because we don't think of autistic people as getting in trouble with the law. We don't think of it because I know myself, I'm a very inherent rule follower, and actually rules give me comfort. Rules give me boundaries. And if I don't have those rules, then I'm kind of in a panic. Like, what do I do? What do I do? So I like having rules. But when a person is in a situation where they are with the police, one of the rules that I would say to them is never go beyond the compliance stage of giving your ID and your name, and always very forcefully say, I would like an attorney at this time. It's actually not enough to say, I think I would like an attorney, or I'm pretty sure that, no, you have to be very forceful in that, because sometimes the officers will work around the ambiguity there and try to continue with the interrogation if there is an interrogation. So there's a specific line that you have to memorize. And we're getting back to the rule following. We do have to teach that because autistic people, even though they are rule followers, are 7 times more likely to get into a confrontation or contact with law enforcement. It's a bit of a paradox that, what I said earlier on about the different behaviors that people on the spectrum give off. I think this is why these confrontations happen. It's a form of ableism in a way, and officers are not trained in this regard. So you don't think that you have to teach your children about this, but you actually do, because there's a very good chance that your child may be confronted by law enforcement, and they need to know what to do in that situation. It happens unexpectedly. You never know when it's going to happen, and it's just something that is always, it could be life-saving as far as teaching your child the right things to do, because there are right and wrong things to do in these encounters. So how do interrogations usually happen? They can happen actually in a number of ways. Anything I say that isn't correct, Elizabeth can correct me on this when it's her turn, but they usually start off by a police or a detective, a policeman or a detective will call the person, or maybe do a visit and say, hey, we're conducting an investigation. It may not even be an investigation on you, but it's an investigation and we think you could help us out. Would you come down to the station? And you're not under arrest right now, so you're not in trouble, and just come down to the station and answer a few questions. When that happens, the person is usually a suspect. So again, this is something that you should teach an autistic person, that when they are given a casual invitation, when it looks like they're not in trouble, they probably, if they're not in trouble, they're being looked at. They're a person of interest or they're a suspect. And as I always say, nothing good can come from talking to a detective. You don't want to be rude to a detective or swear at them or anything like that. You just want to calmly say, as I said earlier, I need to speak with an attorney. And the thing about autistic people is we have such a strong sense of justice that we could be innocent, totally innocent, and want to explain ourselves. No, I didn't do this, and let me tell you why I didn't do this. I'm innocent, I'm innocent. That doesn't help you in that situation. And autistic people, because there's such a justice-oriented focus within us, and I would say that's true for myself, we want to explain, no, you've got this all wrong. This isn't me, this isn't me. And it's so counterintuitive to want to be silent in that situation because you want to explain yourself. But it's not going to, nothing good can come from it. So they will try to twist what you're saying, and they've pretty much made up their mind at that point that you are the person that committed the crime, and all they're looking for is a confession. They're not really looking for your side of the story. They're looking for a confession at that point. So they'll spend hours and hours and hours with you trying to get that confession. I don't know if any of you remember seeing Making of a Murderer with Brendan Dassey. I hope I pronounced that right, but he was tricked into confessing because they told him that he could go back to class if he told them what they wanted to hear. And he was an IDD student at a high school, and they questioned him without his parents being present, et cetera, et cetera. So we see a bunch of exonerated cases for developmentally disabled individuals because of a false confession, because autistic people want to get out of this situation. They want to tell the people who are reporting in that situation what they want to hear, and they think that that will solve a problem. So there are a lot of exonerated cases, and a lot of them happen to be from developmentally disabled individuals. As I talked about, there's Supreme Court precedent that police officers and detectives are allowed to lie. So they're allowed to say, we actually have your, evidence that your phone pinged off this tower. We know you were there, even if they didn't. Now, for an autistic person, for me, if I didn't know any of this, I would think of police as, they are good guys, and they are for the most part. They do go out there and risk their lives to protect us, but you have to know that in certain situations, they're allowed to lie to you. And my black and white brain can sometimes say, oh, if they're telling me that happened, it must have been, I don't know how it could have happened, but they're telling me that it happened. So I guess, yeah, okay, I'll just agree with what they're saying. No, you can't do that. They have a number of techniques that they develop to establish rapport with you as they're about to interview you. Again, I think these are things that are dangerous for autistic people because they're looking to put the autistic person at ease, and the autistic person, if they're not reading the cues of the situation, doesn't know that this person may not be or isn't on their side. And I have to say, this isn't just something that autistic people struggle with. Neurotypicals fall in the same category. They generally will talk to a detective, even though they know that they probably shouldn't. Another thing that can happen is that detectives will look for unusual body language. For example, not making eye contact, stimming, looking up at the ceiling. These are all, to them, signs of guilt. And we could be doing all these things alone. Often in my, where I live, I look up at the ceiling and I twiddle my thumbs, or I verbally stim, or sometimes I'll even flap. These, for somebody who's trained in autism, these behaviors would be, yeah, okay, I think this guy's on the spectrum, definitely. But for a detective who's only thinking about trying to get the guilty plea, they're looking at this person is deceptive. They are not making eye contact. They're not acting the way a typical suspect would act at that point. I've already talked about how officers will make promises. We'll work with the DA. We'll try to get, but this is your only chance, your one chance to tell us the truth. So there's a lot of pressure on the person, and that you just have to resist it and remain silent. So I'm going to try to go through this real quick because I know Elizabeth, she has a lot of valuable information. Some of the crimes that we often see are, there can be stalking when there's rumination and obsessional qualities to, a person being interested in another person. Meltdowns with police officers, usually these are triggers that are involved, so it's not malicious behavior. Arson can happen, not very often, but it's usually more of a curiosity and fire and flames, and not malicious destruction of property, but more of a curiosity. Sex crimes, I assume Elizabeth is going to get into this, but unfortunately, because we live in an age of the internet and how easy it is to get on these websites where people say they're 18 oftentimes, but they're not, that can easily happen, and it's probably a majority of cases that Elizabeth sees, I would guess, and she could correct me if I'm wrong on that. There can be violence, again, I think usually when there's triggers, and there can be hacking, not very often, but usually if they're befriended into an online community. There's also, what we're seeing a lot of is, I hate to say it, but political type of befriendment where I'm familiar with several cases of January 6 individuals who were kind of radicalized. And I don't say this as a Democrat or Republican, but I'm just being objective here. And they were radicalized to come down to the Capitol and participate in that event, unfortunately. This quote by Simon Baron-Cohen is, I think, very important. And he says, I like to say, putting an autistic person in prison and expecting them to cope is like pushing someone with physical disabilities into a pool and expecting them to swim. And that's exactly right. She's going to get into the jail and prison accommodations or lack of accommodations. I'm running out of time, but I urge you to Google this. This is a law that was passed in Virginia in 2020. I'd like to see it replicated across all 50 states because I think it's very important. It would be a good measure of prevention so that we don't continue to see autistic people end up in the criminal justice system. So if you Google Virginia HB 134, that was passed in 2020. It started out as a House bill. I think that would be something that would be worth looking into. And I know I have several other slides. Basically, I'm going to sum it up in 2 minutes because I want to give this time to Elizabeth. When you do sex education for people on the spectrum, there have been studies on this, and autistic people are really turned off by the notion of sex negative sex education. In other words, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. They preferred, and I could see where I would be like this if I was a teenager today, sex neutral or sex positive. That can be a problem because there are certain things that a person can't do. And so you have to walk a fine line between sex positive education and only abstinence education with, you know, there are certain dangers like going into a Grinder account and thinking everybody's 18. That's not where you want to learn about sex. You want to learn about sex from people, you know, who you can befriend or who can befriend you. And that leads me into my next slide about how most of the information people are taking in today is from the internet when it comes to sex, and that's bad. We want to change that. So I think that peer mentoring would be a great thing, because I think that if it's authentic and if the person doesn't feel like they were forced to be in that situation, peer mentoring, sex education, all of those things. And now I will turn this over to Elizabeth.
Thank you, Nick. That was magnificent, and I'm sure many people in the audience will find it helpful. If, heaven forbid, you are not in a position to follow all of Nick's advice, and you or a family member or a friend on the spectrum gets caught up in the criminal justice system, then please pay attention to the next 25 minutes or so. Very quickly during the course of representation, I unfortunately have to tell the client on the spectrum, as well as their family, that you are approaching all of this as a person with common sense. However, the criminal justice system does not always operate in a way that seems logical, that seems rational. We grew up in this country learning concepts like innocent unless proven guilty, and presumption of innocence, and all of those wonderful, heartwarming, all-American concepts. But unfortunately, the system does not always play out like that. The threshold issue for any criminal proceeding is that of competency. And this is a nationwide standard that was established by the United States Supreme Court back in 1960 in a case called Dusky v. US. And it says that one needs to possess a couple of qualities in order to be competent. First of all, you have to understand what's going on. And secondly, you need to be able to assist your attorney. Now, that seems simple enough, but the way the courts have interpreted this standard is that the standard is very low. Now, in particular, when you are dealing with someone on the autism spectrum who is highly intelligent, who maybe is successful in a variety of different aspects of their lives, it's very, very difficult to convince a court that someone is, quote unquote, not competent to proceed. It's a bit easier if that person on the spectrum has an intellectual disability. But as you all know, the term spectrum is tremendously wide, tremendously rich, tremendously diverse, and every person on the spectrum presents him or herself differently. But unfortunately, it is these very confining definitions that we have to work within in the criminal justice system. So it's not enough for you to tell your attorney, well, he doesn't know what's going on, he doesn't get it. The definition is much more precise, and the only way you can really be successful with an argument that someone is not competent to proceed is with a very thorough forensic evaluation, which I'll discuss later. Next slide, please. If, however, an individual is found incompetent to proceed, that doesn't mean that the charges are dismissed. Would that it were that simple. Rather, the court will order that someone undergo a period of restoration. And again, this term, this concept, does not serve people on the autism spectrum well. In fact, it doesn't serve people with most kinds of mental disabilities well. So, for instance, if someone is on the spectrum, but they have an intellectual disability, then they really can't be restored. On another level, if you have someone who has dementia, indeed they cannot and will never be restored. The metaphor I always use with families is that once your loved one falls off the cliff, there's no way to bring him or her back. The only way that someone with a mental disability in general and autism spectrum in particular can be, quote unquote, restored to competency is if they have some symptoms that can be medicated. For instance, in the case of someone with a co-occurring disorder that might be a mental illness, or if they have other symptoms that can be managed. Backing up a few steps, what court-ordered restoration means is that someone, either on an outpatient basis or in an inpatient basis, will go to classes and learn about the criminal justice system. And they will be taught very superficial knowledge. They will be taught to repeat back what the role of a judge is, what the role of their attorney is, what the role of a prosecutor is. What is the difference between going to trial and entering a guilty plea? They will ask if they understand what the maximum amount of time they could be facing. And if one can successfully parrot back those answers, then one has been restored and one is indeed competent to proceed. Before we go on to the next slide, it's important to remember that competency is a measure of that person's ability in the here and now, whether it is during pretrial proceedings or a trial or a sentencing, or as perverse as it may sound, at the time of execution. But it is a continuing inquiry, and it is one that an attorney is required to continually make. Next slide, please. On the other hand, criminal responsibility is a measurement of the person's state of mind at the time of the alleged offense. The most popular variation of this is insane at the time of the act. It basically requires that a forensic expert go back to the moment in time and take a snapshot of that person's level of functioning. Next slide, please. I think there was one before that, Nick. No, you're right. You can go to the next, I'm sorry. Depending upon the jurisdiction where the person is charged, there are very different definitions of insanity. But the federal definition is one that is, it captures the essence of insanity throughout the country. And it's important for those of you who have heard of history or who have lived through history to know that following the attempted assassination of President Reagan by John Hinckley, who was found not guilty by reason of insanity, insanity statutes throughout the country were tightened because there was the myth following that verdict that people were getting off all over the place on technicalities simply by entering a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. That is the farthest thing from the truth for a couple of different reasons, not the least of which is a good attorney will know that this is a difficult standard to meet. In particular, for people on the autism spectrum, the term insanity does a tremendous disservice because, as you all know, autism spectrum disorder is not a mental illness, and that's what insanity implies. So it may very well be a person on the spectrum did not know what he or she was doing, did not know that it was wrong, did not know that it was unlawful, did not appreciate the consequences of it. But unfortunately, the box that the legal system has given us is a box called insanity. Next slide, please. Now, many moments ago, I talked about the forensic expert. When I am meeting with clients and their families, one of the very first things I do is get the appropriate expert or team of experts on board. And this is crucial for the successful outcome of a case. Now, many times, families and clients tell me, well, he was diagnosed when he was 4 years old, or she's been in treatment since she was 12. That is wonderful. That is helpful. And indeed, the expert is going to make note of that in the report. But there needs to be an independent forensic evaluation for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which is it is a conflict of interest for the treatment provider to provide the forensic evaluation. Now, I talked about how it was important for the expert to cite the fact that that individual has been in treatment. One of the reasons why it's important, particularly if that person has undergone treatment or therapy or been diagnosed for a number of years, is it helps dispel any accusations that he or she is malingering, that the client has come forward with this diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder because of convenience. That is the farthest thing from the truth. The long-standing diagnosis, the history of receiving various accommodations will help dispel that. And I want to go through a few different issues that counsel as well as family should be aware of when finding an independent forensic expert. First and foremost, you should get that expert on board as quickly as possible for a variety of different reasons, not the least of which is that the expert can develop a real bond of trust with the individual. And in fact, there may need to be a series of interviews. And it's vitally important that the person who is accused can trust the expert. Also, particularly if people have been diagnosed for many years and or have seen various specialists and been in a variety of different programs, there are a lot of records to review. And a good forensic expert will want to review everything. And also, it's important to remember that a good expert will know that he or she needs to stay in his or her lane. So for instance, you may have one expert who only wants to give a diagnostic report, who does not want to review the discovery. You may also have an expert who does not feel qualified to render an opinion about future dangerousness. Indeed, there are very specific testing instruments that are administered to gauge future dangerousness. And you want your experts to be as strongly credentialed as possible for purposes of credibility. Next slide, please, Nick. Now, a good evaluation, a powerful evaluation, is vital to the success of a case. Let's back up a few steps. You may go into your attorney's office. You may present your attorney with boxes of treatment records. And you may have years worth of anecdotes about your loved one's behavior. That is wonderful. That is valuable. That will be of tremendous use. But your attorney is not a mental health expert. So your attorney can't get up and say, so-and-so is on the autism spectrum. This, Your Honor, is the nexus between the alleged offense and the diagnosis, and then talk about what accommodations the individual needs in order to no longer be a danger to the community and ensure the court that this offense can never happen again. The attorney's not a doctor. You need an independent evaluation, a thorough multi-page evaluation that will address all aspects of the diagnosis, the offense, the circumstances leading to the offense, anything surrounding the aftermath of the offense, like a police interrogation, conduct during the arrest, any confession, and what sort of accommodations that individual would need for a non-prison sentence. You need, it's sort of like performing your own dental surgery. You would not do it in that circumstance. So too, you need to have an expert appear on your loved one's behalf, on your behalf. And a good evaluation has many components, including but not limited to a thorough interview, a multi-day interview with a client, or a series of interviews with a client, collateral interviews with family, friends, coworkers, anyone who knows the person on the spectrum and who can talk with authority that this is a long-standing issue, not manufactured for purposes of litigation. As I said before, there will be a very intensive document review. There will be testing instruments that will be administered and then interpreted for the court. And even if you are not able to proceed with not competent to proceed or insane at the time of the act, all of this information distilled into a report or reports will be powerful in terms of leveraging a better plea, or again, depending upon the nature of the charges, the severity of the charges, any prior record, and of course the individual jurisdiction, getting the charges dismissed. Now, before I proceed, I've talked a lot about entering a plea and alleged conduct and those sorts of things. Make no mistake, I am not trying to say that you should wave the white flag in this case. You, your loved one, may have a case of actual innocence, and that indeed should be litigated on all of the different fronts. Also, depending upon the specific statute under which you or your loved one is charged, you may be able to, and your lawyer can explain this better to you, have a certain element of that offense, namely that of intent, negated. On the other hand, if you are in federal court and you or a loved one is charged with a child pornography offense, that in many circumstances is basically strict liability. But nonetheless, you need to explore every avenue. But if in fact there is not a valid defense, this is not a case for whatever reason should not go to trial or cannot go to trial, your experts are going to be crucial in terms of leveraging a better plea or some other favorable outcome. Next slide. And a final note. I've already discussed mitigation leveraging a plea. In many jurisdictions, there are problem-solving courts. There may be some attempts to divert someone on the autism spectrum into a problem-solving court. It may not be a viable option for everyone, and that should be explored. Next slide, please. Basically, what counsel needs to do is assure the prosecutor, assure the court that there is a path forward, that jail and prison are the worst possible places in the world for someone on the autism spectrum, but there is a path forward. And counsel needs to present to the prosecutor, to the court, what the treatment plan will be, whether it is counseling, sex offender counseling, sex education, skills of daily living, accommodating the autism spectrum disorder, counseling to ensure that this individual will not commit the same type of offense in the future. secure housing, perhaps supervised housing, depending upon the level of executive functioning, and also how the person is going to occupy his or her time. If the person is capable of working, where the work site will be, what the transportation to and from will be, if the person indeed is a student and has aspirations to continue college or even graduate school, what that course will be. Next slide, please. Built into the path forward is the fact that jail or prison is fraught with landmines for an individual on the autism spectrum for a variety of different reasons that I've listed, but perhaps the most important is depending upon the way the person on the autism spectrum manifests the symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, there will be sensory issues. And the sounds, the sights, the smells of a prison environment will be hell on earth for that individual. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, I ran out of time, but Nick and I are happy to answer any questions in the remaining minutes. And you are welcome to contact me at any point through any of these different platforms. But in particular, I call your attention to my website, where there is a free document on there called a family guide.
Thank you both so much for, this really invaluable information, and what a great presentation. So I want to thank you both so much for participating. I do have some questions and obviously very limited time, so if you don't mind, I'll get right into those. So the first question, can you discuss the role of attorneys in advocating for accommodations and supports for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities within the legal system? And some examples are access to assistive technology, interpreters, or their legal guardians in their case.
You want to start, Nick? And I'll be cleanup batter.
I think you could take this, actually.
Okay. Well, again, it depends upon where that person falls within the spectrum and the resources available within a jurisdiction, and also how open-minded the jurisdiction is. A person on the spectrum is entitled to accommodations under the ADA. And counsel needs to be familiar with the client, spend time with the client, listen to the client, listen to the family, and find out what sort of resources will be helpful and make that person successful. And then have a conversation with the court or the probation department, file a motion if need be, but just explain. And I have found that courts and probation officers are relatively open, in large part because no one has ever asked before. But if you ask with precision, then they could very well be open to it.
I would just add that in cases where it's not being enforced and somebody has made a request, that they should contact either the Autism Society of America's Justice Task Force or the local disability protection agencies that exist in every state. A lot of those agencies can't help out with the criminal matter or with the case itself, but they can make sure or try to make sure at least that ADA accommodations are being followed.
That's a great point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that information.
And also, if I could add, another challenge that we face in the system is, and you've all heard this phrase before, autism is an individual invisible disability. And that's true in many circumstances. And it just never dawns on the court that this person needs something. So make that known.
Right. Agreed with that. So earlier in the presentation, you mentioned assessments and how important assessments are. So this question has to do with that realm. So what role do standardized assessment tools and diagnostic criteria play in the evaluation process for individuals with autism within the criminal justice system? Are there specific assessments to detect autism? And how do professionals adapt these tools to account for the unique characteristics and needs of individuals with autism? So this is multi-pronged.
That's a webinar unto itself. Let me bite off a few pieces, Nick, and then you can bite off a couple. Autism spectrum disorder is a very specialized field. And my strong recommendation is that your forensic expert have a particular expertise in autism spectrum disorder. Because of that expert will know exactly what testing instruments to administer and how they should be used and how they should be interpreted. And it's important. We can allege that our client, if you will, only functions at a 6th grade level in this area, or a 3rd grade area in that area. But if you have a variety of different tests which show he only functions in the single-digit percentile here and single-digit percentile there, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and then link it all together to show that based on that profile, that was why the person was susceptible to committing the conduct charged, or based on those results, this is what prison could be for that individual. That is powerful, objective evidence.
Yeah, and I would piggyback on that by saying it can also be counterproductive if you find an expert who is a generalized forensic psychologist with, information on every diagnosis in the DSM, but particularly if they don't specialize in autism, they could have a confidence in themselves that they really are able to assess this person, but they could end up putting things in the report because of their lack of knowledge about autism that are actually harmful. And in that case, the attorney, the person has spent $2,000, $3,000, and it's a worthless piece of paper, 20-page paper. So it can actually be harmful to go to people like that, and you want to make sure that the person actually specializes in both. And this can be difficult because there's not a ton of people that do this, but that they have dual specialties in forensic psychology and autism spectrum disorder or disability.
That's great advice, actually. Thank you for that. So it is 1 o'clock. So I do want to shut this down, but I do have a few more questions. And as mentioned during the introduction, I will reach out to both Elizabeth and Nick after the presentation to try to get those answered for you. And I will reach back out with the answers to the questions within the week, within the next few days. So again, I want to thank the presenters. Thank you so much for this information. As mentioned, hugely valuable. And thank you for everyone participating, and have a great day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robin. Goodbye, everyone.
Goodbye.